So, I mean, we're trying to understand the Chinese. And, you know, I think that, you know, that nation-state level, man, the state, and war, is clearly still with us, especially in Asia. And how do we deal with China as a rising power? But then, you know, there's the issue of the international system itself, which was the metaphor that Walsh was using when he talked about war. You know, how do we manage that system? You know, how do we think about a grand strategy? And I know Dennis Ippolito's still here hiding in the back. You know, with all due respect to things that are data-driven and the need for data, and we can't live without data. That's quite clear. But we also can't live, I don't think, for long without strategy. So, you know, how do we manage this world in which we live? I mean, what should be the foreign policy of the United States? How do we build an architecture that's going to make a peaceful world for our children and our grandchildren? How much is it going to cost us? You know, those are still very burning issues. And I hope that everybody in this audience, you know, has gone away from here at least a little bit more enlightened, you know, knowing a little bit more about the trade-offs that we're going to have to make and the choices that we're going to have to face, you know, and how we're going to get past the gridlock and the polarization, because we will have to do that. And let's hope that it's not a major crisis that forces us to get past that. So, you know, those are my 2 cents worth here at the end, trying to link a little bit strategy, forces, and budgets, and bring us back to that simple Waltzian paradigm, man, the state, and war. So I think what I would like to do now, having heard from the 4 of us, just take a few minutes at the end and ask people to say your piece, ask any final questions you might have, and we'll do the best we can to answer them in the few minutes we have left.
But I'm going to get a glass of wine while you think.
Okay, and, don't hesitate to go get another, to get a refill. But I see that General Zanini already wants to get in on this, so
yeah,
let's.
Sure what I found interesting.
And come on.
What I found interesting today, last night and today as we went through it, that the discussion has shifted very clearly to Asia. And yet, the ball that still troubles us in the Middle East continues. No discussion, not even mention, about the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter, or a little discussion about maybe Syria. But the struggles that we see in the Middle East, and, if you will, the trauma that's ongoing within many of our friends in the Middle East. If you look at Saudi Arabia today, who's looking at moving from a country that's focused on wealth at the very high end to figuring out how do they distribute wealth across the population, and not just by handouts, but in true meaning of wealth as you go through, in a way of living in a way. You find that in United Arab Emirates, you find that in Qatar, you find it throughout the region. We didn't talk about that. And when we talk about strategy and forces and budget, we need to include that as well.
Well, it reminds me of, I mean, we're looking at the South here. I mean, I think there were allusions to this. You know, if conflict is going to come, if change is going to come, I heard this from General Scales. It's going to come from the South. That's what you think, not from China, not from the classic nation-state conflict, but from that sort of pre-Westphalian world that is the Middle East and Africa.
Well, I think I said this. I think I said that Saudi Arabia would be the home of Islam, and Persia would be the home of our most ancient civilizations, Tigris and Euphrates, if it wasn't for nukes and oil. And nukes and oil are essentially are essentially 2 forces that keep the Middle East unstable. We wouldn't care, probably we'd care, but we wouldn't be so obsessed with the Arab Spring or what's happening in Syria, Yemen, if it wasn't for the fear of terrorism. The culminating point would be a nuclear weapon in the United States and our dependence on fossil fuel. So I think that's what makes that region of the world, to Dan's point, particularly volatile. I mean, who knows? But back to the whole point about Harry Truman not knowing where Korea was in 1950. I'm just so jaded as a historian, jaded and cynical of the lack of the ability of our American defense intellectual community to forecast anything other than the sunrise tomorrow. It makes me very, very, very nervous when anyone tries to forecast war about anybody in any place at any time. I just think it's, you know, so much of war is driven by caprice and accident. I think somebody said that earlier today. It's driven by, it's not driven by the rising tide of the oceans or by globalism. It's driven by Barbara Bush rolling over to George and said, you can't let those Somalis starve. The causes of war are so unpredictable. The only thing I ask of our leaders in defense right now is before you think about how to start a war, please give a lot of thought about how you end it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as a community, I think what we've not done well is understand war termination instead of war beginning. We should always start with the end before we get to the beginning. Gentlemen.
I think of Black Hawk Down, Mogadishu, and our forces went in to capture 2 dead bodies. And then I bring myself trying to reconcile what occurred 2 months ago on 9/11 in Benghazi, when we allegedly knew that there was a major firefight or attack, and we didn't respond, apparently. Any thoughts?
Well, Michael and I have been had our very handsome faces on television several times over the last few weeks talking about that. I'll give you my thoughts, and this is after I've probably said too much on the subject. Right now, I just don't think we know. I went in, I think, oh gosh, where was I? I was on Greta and a couple other shows, ranting and railing about Benghazi, and I started getting floods of emails from my friends in the military, the active military, telling me hey Bob, before you get too wrapped up in this, you need to back off. And my colleague at Fox, Jennifer Griffin, who Michael and I know and respect enormously, has a different view. So the bottom line, at this point, all we know is that the forces weren't positioned in the right place to react within the 7-hour time limit. That's what we do know. But whether or not any of this rises above just the frictions of war, you know, I've been in operations a lot, so has Pat. And I got to tell you, what's the word I'm looking for, Pat? But when you're on an operation and real forces are involved and people are dying, sometimes you just screw it up. And you feel real bad about it. Sometimes it's just the frictions of war. And I don't want to get too philosophical on you, but I can set it, if you're sitting in a talk and the radios are blaring in your ear and people are screaming and bullets are cracking over your head, it's a little different situation than suddenly waking up one morning and trying to figure out what really happened. And so I guess I'm going to be neutral in this after not being neutral early on and say, I really don't know. I really don't know. Eventually we're going to know. But I just don't know. Michael?
I'll add one brief point. I think that's well said. And I think there's no doubt this was not our finest hour. There's no doubt that when you do a lessons learned, the way these guys in their careers always have done well, and the institution of the U.S. military and many other institutions, but especially the military, does this very well. You would learn lessons, and you would have done it differently had you thought it through. There's no doubt about that. What's regrettable here is that because of the timing, this was so dramatized, magnified, and politicized that we're having a hard time just learning the lessons. Yeah. There are tragedies in any major operation. There are mistakes made. There's no doubt that consulate in Benghazi should have been better protected. I just don't see that as really a serious point of contention anymore. Right. I doubt very much that once we made the mistake not to really protect it very well, that we could have adequately responded in the time frames. I know General Petraeus is looking forward to being able to talk about this a little tomorrow, and I think that, seriously, I mean, I think that under the circumstance, whatever mistake was made by our whole government before the tragedy of September 11th. There's no doubt that it would have been hard, maybe not impossible, but hard to mitigate it once the actual events began. Could we have talked about it better? Could we have acknowledged right away that we were more uncertain of the cause? Do I admire everything that my good friend Susan Rice or my president Barack Obama said about it? Probably not, but I also think that every administration has made mistakes of at least this magnitude. Every field commander has wound up seeing tactical operations go wrong with at least this much loss in life in any big campaign. And so I just want to get to the point where we learn the lessons and correct the mistakes and tone it down. There are good arguments for and against Susan Rice as Secretary of State. This is not one of them in either category. I'll leave it at that.
Let me just tell you a quick war story. I do staff ride to the Little Bighorn every year. And usually it's for finance capitalists, 26-year-old guys who not only have never ridden a horse, but never seen one. And it is hilarious. And by the way, these are not, nose and butt pony trail horses. These are Indian horses, hilarious. But one of the point I teach, and how am I getting to Benghazi over this? The point I teach is that decision-making is oftentimes done with imperfect information in a condition of environmental isolation. And would I take these guys over the 7 decision points that Custer made? The 8th one the 8th one you're familiar with. But at each stage of that, when you make the decision knowing what Custer knew in the conditions that he was in at the time, in the environment that he was immersed in, it made a lot of sense. But when you get to that 8th one, it looks really bad. And so what's the lesson for Benghazi? The lesson is when you unpack this, and it was a chain of decisions, you need to look not just at each decision in isolation, but you need to look at the continuum of operational decision-making to understand whether or not this was wise or not. But you just can't cherry-pick a single point and say, well, that's where it went wrong. Well, you don't really know that until you've actually been through it. Does that make sense?
Yes. Pat, would you add anything to that?
Just there's one dimension to it that hasn't come out. I don't have any privileged information or insight, but I can tell you what it's like in a combat scenario where there's people who are down and you don't know how to evaluate the risk to the 35 or 40 other people who are standing in line ready to go. And I think it's one of the hardest dilemmas that commanders have to make, which is to evaluate not only the situation for those who are immediately affected, but now the raw calculus they have to make as to whether or not we should put more lives at risk. And I've seen this play out on 3 separate occasions where all we had was a pencil and a string trying to determine where an airplane was during Desert Storm, and whether or not we were going to put 50 more airplanes in the air to find this, and not knowing whether or not the pilot was alive. So it is, whatever the after action reads, there's no one who is a more blistering, harsh critic of us than us. Right. And if you don't realize that, it's just simply you haven't been exposed to the culture. There is a very strong sense of loyalty to the Constitution, loyalty to the chain of command, which the likes of which I haven't seen in the private sector. And it would be striking if you had a chance to take a look at that up close.
Wow.
So I'm confident in the truth coming out.
Annie?
I wonder if our experts could speak to the issue of our relationship with our allies and these friends and partners that we have. As we look into the future after Afghanistan, after Iraq, and the military has been engaging in a lot of security cooperation activities, security assistance activities, and clearly there are implications on what kind of strategy we will have. Who are the ones we'll be working with? And then on our forces, what kind of capabilities we need to work with them? And as well as the kind of budget issues. Do we sell them stuff? Do we give them stuff? And all the associated issues. I just recall a handful of months ago when I supported the Army's Unified Quest event, specifically on partnership. At the end of 4 days, my main takeaway was that people from the major, the captain, all the way to the colonels coming from different offices that were involved in that meeting, there is no single understanding on what partnership is. And without that understanding, they can't move forward in terms of their articulation of what the Army's strategy should be, what our forces should be, and what kind of resources we should commit to working with these allies.
Starting with forces here.
Let me make 2 points about forces. First of all, anytime you start bitching about the defense budget, talk to a Brit, a German, or, you know, pick your country. The British Army is the smallest it's been since the Second Afghan War. German Army is now down to 58,000. The French are not able to project more than a single brigade. The British can't even do that. Wow. So even though our forces are going down dramatically, I mean, many of the NATO principles have really become terribly dependent on us. The second thing about coalitions and partnerships, you know, I wrote a book on the Gulf War called Certain Victory. And the thing that I got so angry about in the decision-making process is when U.S. commanders expected our coalition partners to be like us. Well, you know what? They weren't. And it wasn't just material. It was culture, and it was education and doctrine and operational savvy and all that sort of thing. Here's what I learned. What I learned was a savvy commander can amplify his fighting strength by understanding what's unique about a coalition partner and using that partner to fit into the panoply of capabilities in a way that best fits the partner. I'll give you one example. Norm Schwarzkopf had this Filipino general show up one day. He said, "I'm here to help." And he says, "How many tanks have you guys?" "I don't have any tanks." He said, "Well, get the hell out of my headquarters." That's a quote. But what the guy brought was, I think, 3 or 4 Filipino hospitals with nurses and doctors, and finally, I forget who intervened and invited them to come back into the coalition. And when we moved into Basra initially, it was those 2 Filipino field hospitals that went on, that did amazing stuff because they were used to dealing with, you know, very poor people in very bad shape. So I guess what I'm telling you is that as a coalition leader, we should never turn down help from anyone. And number 2 is don't expect them to have our radars and our satellite phones and all that, but they all have something you can use. And shame on a commander who doesn't fully exploit, because we don't have the manpower to do it all ourselves anymore. That makes sense?
So there's a budgetary implication to the example that was just described. I was at the Office of Management and Budget for a year, and when I completed my White House Fellowship, I went back to the fleet that turned out to be Desert Storm. I came through OMB as we wrapped up Desert Storm. Was approached by one of the budget examiners with a small problem. The cost of the war was $59 billion. The cash and receipts in kind was $60 billion. We had made $1 billion, and they didn't quite know how to score it. So, and just thought the whole strategic communication would be a problem if we came out profitable after this extraordinary coalition effort. Other thing, if you were to look inside the command and control structure during Desert Storm, rather than the traditional sort of line of authority, which is senior subordinate relationships, down a nice, clean, straight line, looked more like an H. So there's no doubt, as far as American forces, who we were working for and what our purpose was in life. But that bar, that horizontal bar, was called the Coalition Command and Control Integration Cell, run by Major General Schwartz. And he made a comment one day during a meeting that resonated for years throughout those who were involved in coalition operations. Find your coalition partner. There was a meeting of just American only, and he walked into that group and said, find your coalition partner and get them into this meeting. Because any time that you present yourself as just a single force amongst yourselves, then you create seeds of distrust here. And it's very hard to write that. So when we went into the Joint Support Force for the tsunami relief, that's the force that we built. It was designed for horizontal collaboration and transparency rather than trying to insist on senior subordinate relationships and vertical lines. We learned a lot from that.
Michael, would you like to add anything?
I'll just make one broad point. These were fantastic observations and a great question. I guess I would just say, you know, we have a glass half full and half empty, but it's half full on allies. And what's incredible, if you take a broad historical perspective, as I know this kind of a university would do and often does and did in the presentations today, the fact that we have still about 60 allies at a time of general international peace is off the charts historically. It's amazing. And it's partly because these kind of individuals work so well and don't put it in people's faces that we're number one and they should just, they have the attitude you just heard, that we try to be as collaborative as we can, and I hope we can pass this culture and this attitude along. But it's also because even though we make a lot of mistakes as a country, we tend to learn from them, debate them, air them out internally, at least as much as anybody airs them out overseas. And the fact, and it was, I think, said earlier by Professor Jillson in the afternoon panel, of the next 15 countries in the world of defense spending, most of them are our allies. And if you do a cumulative running total of global GDP, global military spending, and you look at sort of the US-led alliance system, define that very broadly and very loosely, but nonetheless, more than half of all global GDP and well over half of global defense spending is within our camp. This is an incredibly good place to be. Another way to look at it, and we complain about allies not doing enough, and they don't, and we always want them to do more, and they don't, and they won't. And like General Scales just said, when you look at their capabilities compared to what they used to be, they're often a pittance. But it's still a wonderfully better place to be than almost any alternative I could imagine. You go over to Afghanistan, you say ISAF is still 2/3 American, 1/3 all the rest of the world combined, but that 1/3 all the rest of the world combined includes 48 countries. I mean, what kind of legitimacy do you get from that? It doesn't win the war for you, unfortunately, and we may or may not turn out in an okay place there. But the ability of the United States to still marshal these kind of coalitions is extraordinary. And I know your question was much more specific, and that's good, but I would just want to conclude on that broader point, that even as we're frustrated by the specific efforts of collaboration in many cases, the overall system of alliances we have is extraordinary.
You know, and the other thing is a lot of these countries fight above their weight. It's helpful in Bosnia to have a Michael Jackson put his arm around Wes Clark's shoulder and say, you know, you bring that airplane in, we're going to be in World War III. Or to have Rupert Smith act as a, what was his name? I want to say Kurt Werner, the German